read through everything. I didn't. I started reading it purposefully so that I could get through all of it, which means I kind of looked at the summaries.
Mm-hmm.
And after the first 3 or 4 chapters, which I read, and yeah, they were, I guess, yeah, just like the others said, a mix of tough going and clarity. And the towards the end, as I was reading more purposefully, I thought, yeah, it's starting to make sense. I'm not sure, having done it so quickly, I'm not sure I have a comprehensive understanding of it, but I can see that uh, there is some general approach to it that he's
Mm-hmm.
presenting. And I have my own understanding of it, but I don't want to bother you guys with that.
Well, we'll definitely see if we can help clarify understanding of it. So questions about that is very much sort of on point here. Okay, so that's good in terms of the reading stuff. Welcome, by the way, Brian. I want to quickly go over just sort of sketching out the territory. Pete mentioned the category stuff, which we'll get to. There's fundamentally a bunch of stuff that comes before the one big quotation from Nietzsche that tries to explain, his view of nihilism in terms of the psychological prerequisites for it or something. And there's multiple chapters that then are all analyzing that chapter of Nietzsche, basically. And then after that's digested, then there's a kind of Heidegger pulling back and viewing all of that thing which Nietzsche just explained as fundamentally about a piece of Western history, or understanding nihilism as something like a meaning, sense, or inner logic of Western history. So roughly there's three, I'm thinking this is three pieces. There's the stuff before the long Nietzsche explanation, the stuff explicating the long Nietzsche explanation, the stuff after the long Nietzsche explanation. And in that first part, there's like 3 different chapters. The first one, as we saw, is like a review of the 5 major rubric stuff. It's like a whirlwind tour review of everything we covered in the whole previous book. So it can seem quite dense at times. It could also seem repetitive. Some of the takes look a little shallow because you're not sure why he's, he goes over things like eternal turn of the same, like in 2 sentences, right? And expects you to get it, right? So there are things like that are challenging if you didn't get the whole previous book. But the fundamental purpose of that first chapter is just to lay out what he plans to do in the whole method here, which is to look at all the different major aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy from the standpoint of nihilism, right? So we're going to, in the whole lecture course, we're going to treat nihilism as the theme, and we're going to approach all the other aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy in how they bear on the historical doctrine of what nihilism is in Nietzsche's sense, right? So the 5 major rubrics are kind of just there at the beginning to say, yeah, yes, we're going to get glances on all this stuff, but the fundamental theme here is going to be not nihilism and everything else. And that's mostly what the first chapter is succeeding in doing. Besides its review aspect, it's just introducing all that. The second one gives Nietzsche's own definition of nihilism, right? I should mention also, the first also mentions a few like other people's definitions of the term or uses of the term, right? So there's a brief mention of Nietzsche's, what Nietzsche means by it instead, but one in the course of introducing the subject of nihilism also just talks about like what everybody else thinks the word means or uses it as, to distinguish that from Nietzsche's use. But the second one is like Nietzsche's actual definition. And the third one, it may be almost hidden in passing because it's about, almost about the word nihil and a few other, if I can put it this way, maybe shallow philosophical objections anticipated from the student audience or something like that. But there's another sleeper going on in 3, which is Heidegger's own definition of nihilism is hiding in chapter 3. And we'll have to bring that out because there's a whole take on a whole critical take of Nietzsche buried in that just allusion to, yeah, that's what Heidegger means. It's not, sorry, that's what Nietzsche means by nihilism, but maybe the basis of the nihilism that he's thinking of is this other nihilism that I'm thinking of. And he gives his own definition. And he says that Nietzsche thinks the essence of nihilism nihilistically. So we definitely need to focus on that and bring out the kind of contrast between what he says there and what Nietzsche said before. And then he's almost immediately going to go back into explication of Nietzsche. So the beginning of 4, the cosmology and psychology chapter, has that long quote from Nietzsche, which is like the substance of the whole middle part of the section, and explicating what Nietzsche means in that is going to be, and unpacking it all and figuring out what it means is going to be the main subject of the remaining 6, right? So this brief flare-up of what Heidegger himself means by nihilism appears, and then it almost goes away again. It's still there. It's going to come out again in other places, but I just want to make sure that that contrast is clear, because there's a shifting of voices here from, explaining what other people think about the word, what Nietzsche means by the word, what Nietzsche's definition of the word, some, student level objections of, when you're talking about nothing, you're talking about it like a thing, and, paradoxes involved in all that, and just getting briefly stuck in those to show that they're there and that you've acknowledged them and, get past them. And then there's an actual definition of nihilism that's Heidegger's own, just sitting there, almost unheralded, and then he goes straight back to explicating Nietzsche. Okay. Another place where that comes up, this counterpoint of what Heidegger himself thinks occurs in 5, when he's talking about what the will wants. The will would rather will nothingness than not will, or that's the most basic fact about human will, according to Nietzsche. And most of that is explication again, but there's other places there where Heidegger's own comments are flare up, and they're referring to his own, if I can put it this way, his own anthropology of human being, or something like that. There's places in both 3 and 5 where, if you've already read Being in Time, right, you're hearing a bunch of extra allusions, right, that you could easily miss otherwise. You'll just notice he's saying something that he doesn't seem to be fully substantiating about some way in which he disagrees with Nietzsche, and then it goes away again. You're not quite sure why it was there. It's almost like an aside. But if your ears are perked up to notice all the ways in which he's objecting to what Nietzsche is saying or thinking, and you can hear the Being in Time references, you can see all the ways he's plugging into his own understanding instead. So I want to highlight those when we get over it, when we go over it rather. I definitely want to talk about categories, as Pete pointed out. And then not just things about the different varieties of nihilism and modern history, but also history. There's a notion of history that Nietzsche has that's being explained there, and there's a separate one that Heidegger himself has. And I want to also bring out the thread of that distinction, all the ways in which Heidegger starts talking about historical action in our history, where he doesn't just means the way that Nietzsche is talking about Western history. And what he means when he says our history, maybe not quite the same thing as the man of Western history in chapter 7. Okay, so that's just a preview. I think in 1, some of the bits that are review of past, we probably don't need to go over in too much detail, but I think it is worth talking at least quickly about the other background. The sort of other background of nihilism is as something going on in the 19th century, which is related to secularization or disenchantment with the world, or positivism, or growing skepticism, or a kind of demoralization in the case of what Dostoevsky talks about in Russia. All of those are sort of, and Jacobi to Fichte. Those are all sort of background meanings of the word, right? And one way to think about this is that by the 1870s, 1880s, when Nietzsche makes it a major thing, nihilism is already like a word of currency for something cultural going on in Europe in the 19th century that he is going to find a deeper meaning and diagnosis of and read more into than these other people have. So these background commentaries, social thinking level commentaries on what nihilism might mean are just sort of describing a more surface symptom that Nietzsche is going to diagnose. The one kind of exception to that is maybe the Jacobi-Fichte exchange that he opens with. And the thing I want to point out there is that for Jacobi, nihilism is his word for idealism that he doesn't like, if I can put it that way. So one way to think of nihilism is what idealism looks like to people who aren't idealists. What German idealism looks like to people who aren't German idealists. And I want to at least bring out why that would be there. What's the connection between that and nihilism, and why is this coming up with Fichte, and how is it related to the direction we're headed of subjectivism in modern philosophy and Descartes and Nietzsche? Because there is a connection. The connection is that Fichte has created a kind of science of logic in which you spin out the essence of the content of consciousness and the imagination from first principles, so to speak. And from Jacobi's point of view, it amounts to saying everything that the human mind thinks about, it only understands if it has constructed it. But that means that it's going to construct it as its own acts out of thoughts. And that means it's going to dissolve everything which isn't its own acts and its own thoughts. So nothing which is not the subject is going to survive this procedure, is the point, right? The attempt to explain all the contents of consciousness from first principles interior to consciousness means that the eventual content of rigorous thought, as this understands itself to be, will be pure subject and nothing but subject and nothing outside the subject. And from Jacobi's point of view, the inability to reach contact with something outside the human mind is what he means by nihilism, right? So to Jacobi, just the fact that one is an idealist is enough to be a nihilist in his view, because you're saying there is nothing outside the contents of consciousness or something like that. So something which is sufficiently subjectivist enough looks to him like it is empty of exterior content. The particular content that Jacobi is most interested in is God. He's going to be gone, and that's why there's a equating of denial of external truth, denial of anything outside the mind, denial of God, and nihilism. All of those things are being equated by Jacobi as his criticisms of Fichte. So the point here is this: in this very first delusion, there's something like the idea that a thoroughly consistent idealism that has no room for anything outside the contents of consciousness has a nihilistic tendency and has an anti-religion tendency. And this was already noted in like the first people who popularized the word in philosophy, right? Okay, and that's the reason that it was, got later transported to uses like positivism, even though positivism, is not the same thing, and empiricism is the farthest thing from idealism and so forth. But both of them were reacted to by people outside of those movements as a rationalist, enlightener, anti-religion, secular thing in modern thought. And in the case of Jacobi, it was particularly subjectivism that he was seeing taken to excess. Okay, so that's all just the kind of references that Heidegger might expect people in the class might know when they hear names like Jacobi and Fichte. Any questions about that?
Okay, so that's the earliest ideas, and that's why it's possibly from the standpoint we're looking at after having read this these chapters now. It's a bit.
It's like the earliest uses of nihilism as a philosophical term, right?
Right.
I mean, people had talked about problem of the nothing or something like that long before, but they wouldn't call it an ism, right? And I think there were a few people before Jacobi who had used the term without any particular technical meaning, but a philosopher giving it a specific technical meaning, the first use of it is Jacobi to Fichte, and it's a term meant to be diagnostic of what results from too thoroughgoing a subjectivism, something like that. Okay. It's noteworthy that in the Dostoevsky foreword on Pushkin, the word itself doesn't appear. But that is definitely, that's by the same time as Nietzsche, it's by the 1880s itself, and that is definitely a movement that was consciously calling itself nihilism in Russia. This idea that there was an intelligentsia in Russia that had no belief in the future of Russian society and thought Russian society was completely screwed up, felt itself completely alienated from the Russian people. Later, they were interested in social revolution. There were anarchists, there were etc. But among them were a nihilistic group of anarchists who were vaguely bohemian in their art interests and cynically not believing in anything in their practical politics and extremist in the result. And when people think of nihilism as the social philosophy of the 19th century anarchist bomb throwers, that's who they're thinking of. They're thinking of the Russian nihilists of the period roughly 1865 to 1900, 1905, I guess. If you want to know, Dostoevsky sort of has their number in the Possessed or in Notes from Underground, right? If you want to know the kind of characters being talked about there in fiction.
So there's something to say about that. So I think the key source in Russian literature is Turgenev and his Fathers and Sons, where the fathers are like the bourgeoisie and the sons have now been brought up without having to struggle like their fathers struggled. But they have all these European ideas and they hate their parents' generation and they're the nihilists. And they refer to themselves as nihilists. And I think then equating the anarchists, the groups that were trying to overthrow the Tsar as nihilists is then partly the Tsar's secret service. That was part of their mission.
Partly, I mean,
to tell the Europeans, stop giving these people exile in Paris and in Switzerland. They're really bad people who want to bring down society. The anarchists, nihilists, same thing.
Right, but the point is there were definitely people, although that's probably true about the police side of it, there definitely were people who fit that description to a T, right? They're the people that were the actual basis of Dostoevsky's characters in the Possessed and so forth.
The anarchists struggling politically were actually idealists. The people
not all of them. Not all of them.
Kropotkin and Bakunin are the three main anarchists.
Just give me a second. Oh, Burley. That's the guy I was thinking of. There was one of the guys we read about in Burley, right, was an example of one of these. And he did run with the same folks. And for a while, Bakunin patronized him. And then he decided that he was a a rogue and an adventurer and too scurrilous to be
Not a
patronized, right?
proper anarchist, didn't know the theory.
There are too many rules in anarchism for this guy, but and the point is that this guy who is presenting himself as a revolutionary tool to those sorts of people was only interested in shocking all the sensibilities of the bourgeoisie, denying all conventional morality, criminality, getting away with stuff, etc. Right, and that's kind of the character that of that underclass that Dostoevsky riffs on, so to speak. But my point is that that's not just a piece of police propaganda. It was actually something. It was also something actually going on. In addition, some of the people that were out to assassinate precisely the czars that had freed the serfs were. It was almost like we called for this forever. Then you did it, and we hate you more for it because you've taken away our ability to orient our lives by our moralizing hatred of your reducing the Russian people to serfdom. Anyway, you can go read more in Burley or Dostoevsky about that period if you want. But anyway, the point.
It's important because that still goes on today.
Of course it does.
Today I can go to right-wing websites and they'll be saying nihilists and anarchists are the people we're protecting society from. And yeah, there are, hotheads who want to just create chaos or whatever. That's a personality type that's always there, but it's part of the ideology of repression to claim, oh, my enemies are nihilists, just like you said, this guy before Nietzsche, who's saying, oh, anybody who's not a materialist is a nihilist, or anybody who's an idealist is a nihilist. Fichte is a nihilist. The nihilist is just used as people who disagree with me are bad. Have got it wrong, right?
This is the point that I'm going to disagree with you, right? Because it is certainly true, and I pointed this out about Jacobi, that it is there being used from outside of a movement as a way of characterizing it from the outside in a hostile manner, right? Or at least a less hostile in that case and more of a disagreement manner. But it is also used. Joe, let me finish. Right? But it is also used as a self-identification thing in the second half of the 19th century. There are plenty of people who are not being called nihilists by their enemies, but are being called nihilists by themselves in their brochures, right? And that's
artists.
And that's an entirely different thing, including political people. The other example I can think of from Nietzsche's works is in the von Hartmann, right? And his pessimism, his world historical pessimism, right? Which thinks that was called nihilism, and including by him, precisely because it saw the goal of the world process as eventually to arrive at the destruction of consciousness, because consciousness was a bad thing because existence was bad, right? And that was not something which was being characterized that way by people outside of Hartmann, right? It was Hartmann's own self-characterization, right? It was how he was being a pessimist. So the point is to understand that there were views like that running around in the 19th century on the fringes, but Hartmann is not entirely fringe. And that's the background color against which Nietzsche is giving this word a broader historical meaning, right? Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
Well, I had, first following on Pete's question, so apparently the adolescent type of nihilists, not the philosophers, were happy to call themselves nihilists because they like calling themselves a negative term that other people condemn. That's very common today, even though they don't understand what they're talking about. But I want to know, who was Bukharin actually disrespecting there by, because Bukharin, he's the anarchist philosopher, right?
Bakunin, we're talking about.
Bakunin, yeah. Okay, yeah. I was trying. So there was. I always liked the fact that he thought Marx himself was a bad guy.
Sure, sure. But the point that I was making is it's one of the characters that Dostoevsky based the Possessed on. He's mentioned in Michael Burley's History, Early Powers. We read a few months ago, back at the beginning of the year, I guess. And he was just a kind of a Russian adventurer in exile, moving in the Russian revolutionary circles, who was an anarchist and was, palling around in Switzerland with the exiles and getting sent on missions back into Russia and so forth, including by Bakunin. But Bakunin found out that he was, actually a scurrilous adventurer who was just knocking up everybody's daughters and, committing murder on the sly and trying to get away with it, and, blackmailing everybody, and he was just a complete rogue, right? And so Bakunin eventually cut him loose and say, "This guy isn't a revolutionary. He's just a scoundrel," right? Whereas previously he had,
and he's named by
Nakayev.
He's actually
Nakayev is the guy's name. Thank you. Yes, he's a real human. He's a real person.
A guy in history that Buchanan knew and was referenced by the author.
He knew it. He knew him. Bakunin originally was taken in by him. Originally used him for missions. Thought he was a dedicated, committed revolutionary with a real hard-nosed attitude who could really get things done. And then discovered that he was being played by him, and then all of that and the affairs involved in it came out in the press, and that breakup between them came out in the press, and that was one of the things that Dostoevsky noticed and included as background material for his novel The Possessed. But anyway, that's all just asides on nihilism as a thing in the 19th century. All of that is the sort of odor that this whole subject matter has before Nietzsche comes to it, right? And as Heidegger says in the very first chapter, right, he uses it instead for an historical movement that is much longer than that, has been going on longer and is still going on now, and he does relate it to the God is dead notion. And is the historical process whereby the dominance of the transcendent becomes null and void, loses its worth and meaning. So that's the fundamental meaning that Nietzsche is putting on it, and then Nietzsche is seeing that as a deeper thing in Western history, right? So he's not going to see it as something which happened in the 19th century as a reaction to the French Revolution or something, or contemporary political fights in Russia or anywhere else, right? It's part of the whole history of Western philosophy in the Western world, from the Greeks to the Middle Ages to Descartes to the modern world, right? To him, and it's fundamentally the loss of any faith in the transcendent, any kind of transcendent. So that's the underlying background of what the term itself means, and sort of the point is that used as a philosophical term by Nietzsche, it's about that historical process, and it's only borrowing the reference to these other cultural things, whether it was from how Jacobi used the term referring to idealism, or some of these political things in the 19th century, or people like von Hartmann in philosophy of history. All of those are just atmospherically related to what Nietzsche means by nihilism. And the fact that we take it seriously as a thing today is primarily, I would say, a result of the influence of Nietzsche rather than those other things. He's going to take it far more seriously than any of that stuff was, and turn it into a description of a central process of Western history, right?
I had one quick question for
go ahead.
Just if when we get a chance.
Go.
So let's say, I know you and Pete seem to differ a little bit. What would be the difference in the conclusions of what we're reading if Pete's right or you're right, or wherever that deviation goes? Is it one of those things where it leads to a completely different conclusion to what we're reading? Because it seems to me like Pete was trying to go there, like, well, these guys, you know what I'm saying? I was just wondering where will we wind up? What destination will we wind up differently at, depending on those different views of what nihilism is
I
and
think
how
he's
it was
just. I think
categorized?
I took Pete to just be trying to say that some of the revolutionaries in Russia weren't nihilists at all, and they were idealists rather than nihilists, and they believed in transcendent ideals rather than trying to overthrow transcendent ideals. They weren't immoralists in that sense. They just had a morality which was, you know, very anti-czarist, and that, you know, painting them otherwise was useful to the czar, right, or something like that. But the point is that you can go to groups for their self-characterizations in those matters rather than just listening to their enemies. A perfectly reasonable point. Okay, so I want to see if there's anything else we want to grab in two. I mean, sorry, in one rather. One is there's parts of it which are reprising all the different, you know, 5 things, you know, will to power, Overman, etc. The one of these which matters a little bit more maybe is he talks about classical nihilism here, that he describes his own metaphysics with this name and conceives it as the counterstroke to all preceding metaphysics. That's important to understand. Nietzsche uses nihilism as a diagnosis of this past history, but he also differentiates between many different kinds of nihilism, and one of them, classical nihilism, as he calls it, he uses to characterize Nietzsche's own position, right? So Nietzsche is not saying that he himself is not a nihilist. He does think that in some sense he's overcoming nihilism or getting through nihilism, or he's found the way out of nihilism, but the way out of nihilism is right through the middle of it, right? Nietzsche conceives of his stages of his own position as being classical nihilism. That's important to understand. Nietzsche is not using nihilism as an outside term of abuse for something he doesn't like. He's using it as a description of a period of Western history that is stretches before us, stretches ahead of us, and in which he positions himself as a participant. He is the understander of European nihilism, and at least at one point in his own development, he himself is going to enunciate the classical nihilist position. Thoughts on that? Questions?
You're talking at the page 11.
Yes.
Classical nihilism then discloses itself as the fulfillment. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, 11. Not just even before then. I thought there was something back even on. Five, right? Nihilism is the increasingly dominant truth that all prior aims of being have become superfluous. With this, the transformation of the Earth's relation to ruling values, nihilism has also perfected itself for the free and genuine task of a new valuation. Such nihilism, which is in itself perfected in its decisive future, may be characterized as classical nihilism. Nietzsche describes his own metaphysics with this name and conceives it to be the counterstroke to all preceding metaphysics. The name nihilism thus loses the purely nihilistic sense, which means the destruction, annihilation of previous values, etc. So the point is that the all prior supreme values having collapsed creates a condition of valuelessness in which there is a new genuine task for revaluation of all values that Nietzsche thinks of his own philosophy as fulfilling, right? Because he has understood how that process happened in the first place and knows the way forward from it, is the claim. In that sense, Nietzsche is not he's not simply railing against or decrying the fact that nihilism occurs, right? Okay, so that part has to be clear from the first chapter. Okay, so what is the definition of nihilism? There's a little bit of methodological stuff, but the answer is very simple. It's, on page 14, a little fragment from Nietzsche. What does nihilism mean? That the uppermost values devaluate themselves or devalue themselves. The aim is lacking, the why receives no answer. This is presented as Nietzsche's definition. He'll give a whole explanation of afterwards how that happens, why that happens as a historical process. But the first thing to see about it is that it is not something that someone else is doing to the uppermost values. It is something the uppermost values are doing to themselves or is happening to them. The uppermost values devalue themselves, right? The fact that it is a process. It is a process of collapse. It is a process of collapse by a kind of inner contradiction or inner inconsistency or something like that. It may be inner inconsistency in the values themselves, or it may be some inconsistency between how the values describe the world and how the world actually is. That's left open. But the highest values collapsing of themselves is what is meant by nihilism as a process, as a historical process. And the reason this matters is that it means that questions of why something is done receive no answer. Action seems aimless, right? And we'll get to in 4 the different components of that process, why he thinks that. But fundamentally, there is a destruction in the belief in all of the hitherto posited fundamental aims of action, right? Is that part
Jason?
completely? Yes, go ahead.
It seems to me this has happened before in history. Is he commenting on that at all? Is he saying this is the first time it's ever happened, or it just happens periodically?
So he's not comparing this to other periods. He's not saying, you know, this is what you also saw in the fall of the Roman Republic or something like that.
Right.
Nietzsche himself and other places will rail against the objective historians, and even Heidegger at times will do this, as able to find you a precedent for anything that has ever happened before, and thus tell you that everything is following sensibly and there is nothing new under the sun. And this is just a piece of their fatalism, so to speak. But Nietzsche does not present it that way.
Ecclesiastes there, ooh.
But Nietzsche does not present it that way. Nietzsche presents this as a fundamentally new thing. He would even say an unprecedented thing, and he would say his own claims for it get, you know, as grandiose as Hegel's, right? That there is a hitherto there were periods of people not believing in particular ideals. They still believed in ideals. It was the particular ideals that they replaced with others. You had periods of chaos or interregnum, different thing, right? What he's saying is happening here is that the belief in the very idea of standards of value not created by man, over man, to which man conforms and is moral or in tune with the cosmos if he does so, and out of step with the cosmos and unjust or something if he does not, that belief is collapsing. And Nietzsche is claiming this as a for the first time thing. He's presenting it as the collapse of a moral worldview that he himself will trace back to Zoroaster, right? He's saying that 3,000 years of Western history from the Persians onward is ending now because the faith in morality is evaporating.
So you said not created by man.
Well, see, this is the thing. Nietzsche's claim is going to be that all these standards that people are obeying because they think that they're objective or cosmic or godlike or outside of man and not created by man, Nietzsche's going to say, in fact, all of them actually were human codes created by man. And in the past, although men have created all of those codes, they have always had a bad conscience about the fact that they were the ones that created them. They didn't sign their names to them and say, this is just my view of things. They believed or pretended, or both, or some mix of both, that they were the eternal affairs written in the heavens, what God wanted, the nature of objective morality, the greatest good for the greatest number, anything but, you know, it is the particular view of Herr Dr. Professor here who demands that you do this because he claims to be your just and rightful ruler. Joe?
That's helpful.
Okay, is not that belief that all of these things basically originate from humans or from the human mind, isn't that simply a simple claim of an atheist? And I can appreciate that many prior non-atheists believe that these things came from a God edict or something, when in fact we might believe they came from some person or contriver of writing.
The disjunction is often presented that way, but there's no necessity to that disjunction, right? So you can have someone who is not a theist, but who thinks that there are objective principles of morality written into the nature of things, and that conformity with them is, wise or just, and non-conformity with them is not, right? So,
so Aristotle would do that.
yeah, but Aristotle is not simply a completely non-theist person, right? He has an Aristotelian thought thinking itself God that isn't anything like a personal God, but he's still got a room for something that he can, call theos, right? But even those who are, not deist in that sense, but even less theist than that, could easily have that view, right? So the point is that there's no necessary disjunction of this view with theism. Now, Nietzsche does think that theism is in a way the single most common version of this, right? He doesn't think it's necessary to it. He thinks what's necessary to it is the two worlds doctrine, or the true world behind the world doctrine, or what he calls succinctly Platonism. And he calls Christianity Platonism for the people. It's the two worlds doctrine with a popular morality of kindness and forbearance that the people like, but as a two worlds doctrine in the Platonic scheme, right? From Nietzsche's point of view, all of the moralities that don't sign their name to it are one or another version of this evasion. They're finding it in the nature of things rather than acknowledging that they're the legislators in the matter. And secondarily, they're all wind up using one or another form of a two worlds doctrine. That there's something about the apparent world which doesn't fit with the morality, but that's the world's fault, not the morality's fault, right? Nietzsche's succinct characterization of all of that is morality in the narrower rather than the broader of the two senses he uses. Sometimes Nietzsche uses morality to mean anything which is about regulating human conduct, and sometimes he means by it the particular moral version of that, where it is what he calls the perspective of good and evil, or the idea that the good man is the man who is obedient to an objective code. From Nietzsche's point of view, the fundamental question is, or not question, the fundamental delimiter of morality in his sense is, morality is the belief that the good man is the man who obeys something, and other than himself, right? Obeys something objective, eternal, true, bigger than him, older than him, whatever. But that the good life is a life of obedience to the proper objective code is, to Nietzsche, the idea of objective morality, and he calls it just morality or moralism, right? And his own view of that is that every such moral doctrine in past human history is an evasion of the legislators not signing their bills, so to speak, right? So the fundamentally new thing that is happening in nihilism is people are no longer believing any of those not signed by humans schemes, so to speak, and as a result, they're not believing in anything. They still have the standard that you should only obey an objective moral truth, but they don't believe in any objective moral truth. The only thing they can find to obey is the edicts and rules of other people, but they have been taught to believe that the mere whims and edicts and rules of other people, to obey them is slavery, not freedom, and that you shouldn't obey them. It's just being stomped on by them if you let them rule you, right? So the net result is people don't want to be ruled, and they have no principles by which they can be ruled, and they deny the Nietzschean will to power of the little petty legislatures around them as just people with trumped up opinions of their own, no reason to obey them, and so the result is a kind of loss of all standards, right? So that's the basic version of this. In 3, he gives a couple of, sorry, not 3, in 4, we'll come back to 3. He gives a couple of examples of this. He talks about 3 different psychological states of nihilism. One is that when we have sought a meaning in all events that is not in them, and the seeker becomes discouraged. And the the meaning he's thinking about seeking in events is, or anything like a particular providence, anything like an aim of history, anything like a notion of progress, anything about a best regime you're trying to achieve, anything where there's a determinate goal of human action that is supposed to justify anything. All of those prove empty, pointless, unachievable, some combination thereof, right? That's the first thing of you seek a meaning in events that they do not possess and become discouraged, right? The second is that having, and that's sort of thinking of a determinate end or purpose or achievable state, right? When that gives way, you instead get those who look for a standard in totality, systemization, organization in all occurrences. So they're not looking for a particular end state, they're looking for a universal logic in events, a logic of history, maybe a logic of progress, a way in which human action fits into some larger whole. They see a meaning for human action in terms of its place in things. And Nietzsche says, at bottom, they want to believe in the value of themselves and their own action by the place that they hold in a transcendent or cosmic scheme, right? You have this part in the divine plan, right? And that is the source from which you derive meaning and purpose and belief in your own value, right? And he says those fall away as well. People lose faith in any of those schemes. The third form is when this world doesn't prove capable of sustaining either the belief in an end state like that or in a systematic total order like that. Instead, you say, well, yes, of course not, but that's just the world's fault, right? The world is incapable of sustaining these idealistic ends or these totalizing schemes of justification, but I've got 6 of them in my hip pocket called ideologies, and I can project them behind the world and say that, and I can condemn this world by the standard of my ideals instead, right? So Nietzsche says the two-world evasion or doctrine is the idea that you can judge the world of becoming and condemn it by its failure to live up to the eternal ideal, right? And this to him is Platonism. It's the characteristic third way out. But his description of how it fails is, as soon as man finds out how that world is fabricated solely out of psychological needs, and that he has absolutely no right to it, the final form of nihilism emerges. It embraces disbelief in any metaphysical world, and thus forbids itself belief in any true world. The point being that the ideals are not only seen to be unrealizable, they are seen to consist in tissues of fantasy, tissues of wish fulfillment. They're not some real eternal cosmic thing behind the world. They're just psychological drives projected into the world and out of the mind, right? So, and his point is, when the people who did that projecting see them as being just their own subconscious needs and longings, they lose belief in them, because they did not believe in them as merely their psychological needs and longings. They believed in them as some true attainable ideal behind the world, right? Which they no longer believe in. So the 3 forms are an achievable end within history or for action, a determinate end of things, and that is blown away by the idea that the actual process of historical becoming achieves nothing. And then it's some systemic order or purpose or particular providence or general scheme of things, and that is blown away by the fact that history is chaos and without order and without meaning, and so forth. And the third one, the ideals behind the world are seen to be falsifications and projections of unconscious psychological needs, and that's all there is in them. And as these 3 different ways of seeing meaning in action dissipate, people see no meaning in action, right? And then Nietzsche describes this as the following. What does it happen at bottom? The feeling of valuelessness was attained with the realization that the overall character of existence may not be interpreted by means of the concept of purpose, the concept of unity, or the concept of truth. Existence aims at nothing and achieves nothing. A comprehensive unity in the polarity of occurrence is lacking. The character of existence is not true, it is false. And one simply lacks any ground for convincing oneself there is a true world behind the apparent world. In short, the categories purpose, unity, being, by which we used to invest some value into the world, we withdraw again, and now the world seems valueless. That is his explanation of the process of nihilism. All right, questions? Joe, you're on mute. You're asking wonderful questions, but I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Occasionally I have to cough, and I don't want to cough.
I
anyway,
understand.
that's at the end of 3 or the end of 4?
This is the beginning of 4, the very beginning of 4. This is pages 24 through 26.
Yes, I was just flipping back and forth between 3 and 4.
Yes.
Good. Thank you for clarifying.
Yes. So that's Nietzsche's full description of the how we arrive at the idea of the valuelessness of the world.
It almost sounds like a lapsed Catholic male in Italy.
I'm sure there's many different versions of lapsed. He gives, lots of different examples of the kinds of ideals to which this has happened, so to speak. But the funny thing, not funny thing, the characteristic thing at the end of the passage, having laid out this, somewhat gloomy view, is that Nietzsche is almost slyly putting his answer into the last sentence or two, right? He's saying, you put all kinds of possible value and meaning into the world, and then you took it back out, and now you see the world is without value, right? The point there is he is highlighting that these are human actions. Both of them are human actions. The value being put there was a human action. It just wasn't a conscious human action. The value being taken away again is a human action. It's an almost involuntary reaction to the disbelief occasioned by the incommensurability between what was put there and what was found empirically to be the case about the world. But both of them Nietzsche sees as human acts of legislative projection, if I can put it that way. And Nietzsche's solution is for that process to be done with eyes open, fully conscious of itself, rather than not to be done. Everything that human beings have ever obeyed was a human mandated law or rule. If it sufficed for all of the human past, it suffices now. The difference is now we know that we're not obeying any principle in the heavens or any nature of things. We're obeying the edicts of particular men for particular reasons, to cultivate particular little, as he puts it, constructs of domination of this or that form of life, right? So Nietzsche presents this as something which is, if not escapable, at least understandable as soon as it is made into a willed and conscious process instead of an unconscious process. And the fact that people do not believe in these things when they see them as being, mere psychological drives is because they are measuring them by the standards of a imagined to be possible objective morality that isn't there. And Nietzsche's own diagnosis of that is that you have discovered that the categories purpose, unity, and being are not applicable to the world as a whole. The overall character of existence may not be interpreted by means of the concepts purpose, unity, or truth. That's what's actually been discovered, he claims.
So it's like the blindfold has been taken off. Nothing's changed about the world. Just our explanation for the world now might be a little bit more, or has the possibility of being a little more realistic.
That's the claim.
Fair?
That's the claim.
The claim.
But it's not just going to be more realistic, because from Nietzsche's point of view, we're going to revalue the previous values we had by thinking previous thoughts about morality backwards. He calls it thinking backwards, because what he means is previously you read off from the nature of what you saw in reality how one should live, and now you realize that you're actually writing it there, not reading it off. And if some people are reading it off obediently, they're only doing it because other people first wrote it there, which means that what was thought of as an ethos of obedience to objective standards is instead a fundamentally political relationship between legislators and followers, something like that.
So this is where he goes with the Ubermensch, where each individual has the opportunity to write it there?
No.
No.
Yes on one and no on two, right? Where he goes with Ubermensch is the ideal of the person who is fully conscious of this process and wills to write his own will into those laws. He is the person who is ready to take upon himself the responsibility for the domination of the earth, right? Even though it means that it is putting all of the rest of mankind that does not make that election into the position of a complete subordinate to his will, and that they're not going to be obeying any principle in the heavens or any objective God or any truth of morality. They're going to be obeying him. And the person for whom that doesn't give him the willies and instead really excites him and is exactly what he's looking forward to, that's the guy he's looking for.
Great. Good. Well, I'm going to go because anything else I learn is just going to confuse me.
You got your marching orders now, right?
I got it now.
Okay. So all of that is the explanation of how the process of nihilism happens in Nietzsche, but I want to jump back for a second to 3, right? Where Heidegger briefly, very briefly, discusses his own definition of nihilism. He says, certainly, this is on page 21, the prevailing opinions, traditional convictions of philosophy are right to insist that the nothing is not a being, no object. But that does not satisfy the question as to whether this non-objective matter really is, inasmuch as it determines the essential unfolding of being. The question remains whether what is not an object and never can be an object, therefore is simply nothingness, and in this turn a nullity. The question arises whether the innermost essence of nihilism and the power of its dominion do not consist precisely in considering the nothing merely a nullity, considering nihilism as an apotheosis of the merely vacuous, as a negation that can be set to rights at once by an energetic affirmation. Perhaps the essence of nihilism consists in not taking the nothing seriously. Okay. Okay. And what if the question, this is now 22, and what if the question about the essence of the nothing with the help of that either or had not been adequately formulated? Finally, what if the default of a developed question about the essence of the nothing were the grounds for the fact that Western metaphysics had to fall prey to nihilism? Nihilism would then be the essential non-thinking of the essence of the nothing. I put it to you that that is Heidegger's own definition of nihilism. It's buried in a would then be, but it's actually a Heideggerian definition of nihilism that's quite different from Nietzsche's. And below that he says, Nietzsche knew and experienced nihilism because he himself thought nihilistic. And Nietzsche's concept of nihilism is itself nihilistic. Consequently, in spite of all his insights, he could not recognize the hidden essence of nihilism. Because right from the outset, solely on the basis of evaluative thought, he conceived of nihilism as a process of the evaluation of the uppermost values. And he says that he did that because he was remaining within metaphysics. But the fundamental point here is that he is diagnosing something limited in perspective in Nietzsche's understanding of nihilism that he is contrasting with another possibility he's just briefly holding out there, which is nihilism would then be the essential non-thinking of the essence of nothing. And this is a typical dense Heideggerian sentence.
Yeah.
Right?
But I can see where he's getting it from. He's getting it from the 1929 What is Metaphysics essay, where that's where he first breaches the notion that and and he's also blaming metaphysics since Plato, that it's not thinking of the nothing as the background from which all things come to presence, i.e. Heidegger's clearing. So in 1929, he's using the nothing as the clearing. And here in, I guess this is around 1940, he's doing the same thing.
He also did the same thing back. You're right, and he also did the same thing back in volume 3. If you remember when he spoke about chaos as the fundamental word for what Nietzsche sees beforehand, and then he contrasted that with the original sense of chaos as the chasm. This is the concept of chaos chapter 12. The Greek word chaos originally means the gaping, etc. So there's, and I want to go back even further, right? So besides the clearing stuff in 29 and later, there's also versions of this that are back in Being in Time Itself, especially in the sections on the conscience and the thrown basis of the thrown null basis of a nullity. There are aspects of nothing which he doesn't just describe as the background clearing in which beings appear, but also finds it in the, I'll put it this way, in the ecstasies of Dasein, that it's part of the nature of human existence to be the null basis of a nullity in multiple senses. So the point is there's both in his own, if I can put it this way, counterpart to metaphysics as the appearings of being, and in his own, I'll put it this way, philosophical anthropology or understanding of the nature of the human subject. In both of those, there is a entirely different doctrine of nothing than the one you find in Nietzsche. And what neither of them is value thinking, right? Both of them are about the conditions of existence and being in existence, and neither of them are about value specifically. And
yeah, so I mean, this is kind of his theme throughout, is Nietzsche is still stuck in metaphysics because he hasn't thought of what are the conditions necessary for there to be values, presence, anything at all.
Right. But presence is in a way less central here than the value part, because even in the two worlds doctrine, value and presence were dichotomous, right? We already had.
No, so
hang on.
In Heidegger's terms, first you have presence. So there's three levels to Heidegger: the ontological, the phenomenological, and then the ontic, let's say. And so first you have to have presence for things to appear, and then we assign values, and that's an ontic level. And different points in history, we assign different values. And to Nietzsche, values is critical, but to Heidegger, that's not what he's really concerned about.
I don't think it's quite that simple, because Heidegger makes the point in this essay itself that value thinking is, at the time when he's writing this, less than 100 years old, and that it really comes in with Nietzsche, becomes a matter of course with Nietzsche, and that even the early moderns wouldn't have spoken of value at all, right? Let alone the Greeks, right?
Yeah, not the Greeks.
But even the moderns are not thinking in value terms, and it is something quite late that he even says that thinking in value terms and talking about culture are the same thing, or he talks about culture and techne being the same thing as well. But value thinking is not something that Heidegger is fitting into a particular ontic level as a matter of course and is otherwise assimilating to his own philosophy. Value thinking is a a way in which essential aspects of the economy of being, if I can put it that way, are being buried, not just missed. And this will come back to in the, what we'll notice again in the categories section, as well as in the contrast with the Greeks and the discussion of Protagoras and how Protagoras is not Nietzsche or even Descartes. But the point I want to make here is that these little asides about here's this other definition of nihilism, right? You might not notice that there's a whole continent sitting under that little other definition of nihilism, but there is. There,
Yeah.
in other, both in other works and all the way back to the Anthropology and Being in Time. Sorry, Pete.
Yeah, and I think this is common to Heidegger. So he has all these books where he lectures on Nietzsche, and then he has other books where he lectures on Kant or Hegel. He very rarely talks about himself. He's always letting aspects of his understanding sort of show up as he talks about somebody else. But he never lectures on Heidegger's philosophy. He's
I'm going to disagree with you. In later years, he did more of the lecturing on other people, but in early years, he did plenty of lecturing on his own philosophy, right?
For example,
Being in Time, Basic Problems of Phenomenology.
That's the monograph he wrote to get tenure.
But
not
others.
His lecture.
If you're talking about lecture courses, you're talking about, hang on. If you're talking about lecture courses, yes, lectures usually have to have another topic, but he has plenty of works in which he's speaking in his own name about his own stuff, including significant portions of the lecture courses too. But this is an aside, right? I want to point out in 5 another place where this allusion to the Heideggerian anthropology comes in, right? He's talking about valuelessness. This is in towards the end of 30 and the top of 31. As soon as we become aware that man seeks a meaning in all events, and as soon as Nietzsche indicates the search for meaning is frustrated, we cannot circumvent questions about what meaning means, about why and to what extent man seeks meaning, why he cannot accept possible disappointment in this matter with indifference, but is troubled and endangered, even shattered by it in his very substance. Nietzsche would never say shattered by it in his very substance. The notion that to fail to find meaning would result not only in something which you cannot view with indifference or troubling and endangering, but shattered by it in one's very substance is very much I'll put it this way, a Heideggerian anthropology understanding of the role of meaning, right? It requires you to understand Dasein as a meaning-seeking thing. And that's what he means by very substance. So, and that Nietzsche does see there as being something essential in search for meaning. He will even go on to call it will, and the later parts here are mostly talking about what Nietzsche says about volition and will, as opposed to what Heidegger says. But here, it's not Nietzsche's economy of the will that's being referred to. It's Heidegger's anthropology of being in time that is talking about the meaning-seeking substance of Dasein, if I can put it that way. So this is another point where he's not just explicating Nietzsche's psychology or his willology, so to speak. He's also explaining how the same things look from the standpoint of Heidegger's own quite different psychology, his different existential psychology. Okay, that's just striking to me because you read that, there's no way that Nietzsche would ever write that line, right? You can tell when he's not explicating something from Nietzsche because there's no way Nietzsche would write that line. If you're talking about, human being needing an aim or a purpose and that the will would rather will nothingness than not will, Nietzsche not only would write those lines, he did write those lines, right? All of that is, Nietzsche's voice. You can hear him, right? But troubled and endangered and shattered by us in his very substance, not something Kierkegaard might write, Certainly Heidegger certainly would write and did write, but not something Nietzsche would ever write. So anyway, those being able to hear those notes of difference is helpful for keeping the registers different of here Nietzsche ends, here Heidegger begins, if that helps.
So that makes Kierkegaard better.
Better than.
And I'm not biased. Everyone, he's all that matters.
You're not biased? All right, we'll come back to category, but let's first talk about this will business. Okay, so the fundamental thing in Nietzsche's language now, and this is the closest that you're going to get to the point where the two will coincide, but it's in Nietzsche's language, is the will to destruction is will nonetheless, and because volition is to will itself, even the will to nothingness still permits willing, that the will itself be, right? Human will needs an aim, it would sooner will nothingness than not will at all. Right, so that's the, and he says that it is precisely from the fundamental fact of human will that it prefers to will to nothing rather than to not will that Nietzsche derives the basic proof for his statement that the will is in essence will to power, right? So in a way, because Nietzsche has made will to power like his basic term of his metaphysics, and that diagnosis is resting upon this fact about human will, you can say this is the base ground, empirical fact or empirical claimed fact about human psychology that Nietzsche is basing his philosophy upon, right? The will wants the will to be, if I can put it that way, and would rather will nothingness than cease willing. Now, I want to just contrast that for just a second, right? When he was growing up, when he's in his 20s, the philosophy that Nietzsche was studying was Schopenhauer, right? And Schopenhauer's attitude towards will is that the will is tragic because it is fruitless, can never achieve what it wants, and the proper moral resolution of the useless strivings of the will is something like a Buddhist releasement from willing, right? The will has to extinguish itself to achieve nirvana or quietude. The only thing achievable in this life is not happiness, but only peace of mind, which is only achievable by the releasing of cares, or the elimination of cares. So the will has to extinguish itself, is the ethical ideal of Schopenhauer, right? And that's the ethical ideal of the philosophy that Nietzsche was trained on. I would say that he rebelled against and found too alien, or found too pessimistic or insufficiently affirming of life or something. But the point is that when Nietzsche claims that this is the core fact about the nature of human will on which he's basing his whole psychology, understand it is something that his philosophical teacher directly contradicted in his mature works, right? It's not something which is such a matter of course that every philosopher understands it or uses it as their first premise of everything, right? He's built into the core of his philosophy a straight denial of Schopenhauer's main moral conclusion. And in part because he found that conclusion pessimism. In the diagnosis of the different stages of nihilism, pessimism is the pre-nihilistic stage, right? It's the stage of despair of the achievement of the achievableness of any of these ideals without recognizing, where that's coming from. But from Nietzsche's point of view, Schopenhauer is stuck at the doorway to nihilism and hasn't managed to enter it yet. And at the doorway to it, he gets stuck on pessimism and thinks that the will is something to be extinguished because it's futile. Okay. And the more mature Nietzsche is like, futile or not, it's what you are, right?
May I interject something?
Sure, absolutely.
Because you mentioned Schopenhauer, and that as I was reading this, that occurred to me. Two names popped to mind: Schopenhauer and Charles Darwin. What he's talking, it seems to me, what Nietzsche's talking about is very similar to the force, and the will to domination is very similar to what Charles Darwin was describing with genetic selection.
Well, leaving aside the mechanics of selection, it was very much the vital force kind of philosophy that was running around the 19th century, whether it was from Darwin or people like Bergson or Dilthey, right? The elan vital, the life force, and you find that in the world as will aspect of Schopenhauer. There is a notion in which something like the will of self-preservation itself, the instinct of self-preservation itself, is a deeper thing in evolution than humanity, right? And it is something that is shared across all living things, something like that. And that's very much where Nietzsche is coming from this. He's thinking all this as a function of bodying life, right? He's not thinking this as something which is specific to human psychology, right? He thinks that it is almost a biological imperative, we tend to say, right? Or he sees more continuity between the content of willing and the what we would call the lower animal drives, right? Than philosophers before him. His characteristic reaction to Hegel is that Hegel has made the world way too rational, and it's not nearly that rational. And the lower drives and what man has in common with the beasts and with his evolutionary past has more to do with how human beings actually are and how they actually behave than the towers of enlightened rationalism created by the Enlightenment philosophers and philosophers, right? As a characteristic 19th century objection to Hegel or to Enlightenment era rationalism. So yes, definitely. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. On the in chapter 5, he tries to go through the explanation of these three different stages, right? And he sort of alludes to the fact that you could give these things actual historical names, right? Section 3 of it, the true world version is kind of Platonism, and the unity one could be Parmenidean, right? And he says there's no name for the first part of it, right? Of just seeing that the world has no goal. You might find that in some of the flux theorists or pre-Socratics, I suppose. But the point is, all of the stages that he's calling nihilism don't look like things that have happened only recently, right? The third stage of Nietzsche's psychological aspects of nihilism is already there in the time of Plato. So as a history, there's something a little curious here, and that's something that Heidegger is pointing out, right? That the psychological version as opposed to the historical version of how this process is supposedly going is so truncated that all the things before the true world version of it, the Platonism version of it, are all compressed into the Greeks. And the Greeks run through the whole thing up to the true world version of it, and then we get Platonism, and it stays till now, right? So Platonism itself may go through stages in the modern era, and that's something Heidegger will probably be a little bit better on than Nietzsche in this regard. But this nihilism process seems to have run through all of its stages as psychologically described by the time Plato put pen to paper, if that makes sense. So you might have been expecting something a little bit less telegraphed historically, where some things had to wait until the early moderns and something had to wait until the German idealists. No, almost everything that he's describing as the essentials of the precursors of nihilism are other than nihilism itself are already there in Plato. The new thing that gives you actual nihilism is that people aren't Platonists anymore, right? The collapse of three, the third of these things, is when man finds out that the true world beyond the world was fabricated out of psychological needs and that he has no right to it. That's the place where he says that nihilism begins to appear. So this means that the decisive process for the advent of nihilism, as opposed to its third evasion in the true world Platonism version, happens only when people stop being Platonists because they see ideals as being fabricated solely out of psychological needs. And I would put it to you that from Nietzsche's own point of view, that's something which he sees as happening specifically within the history of modern philosophy. He uses almost the same language about no right to them psychological needs about Kant, for example, about synthetic judgments a priori. And he says, we have no right to them. They are for us simply false judgments, but not that that's an objection to them. We do false judgments all the time when they're useful to us, but we have no right to them. They're purely things that we need, right? That's Nietzsche's take on Kant looking around for synthetic judgments a priori. So what's the point? The point is that it is within specifically modern philosophy that that people are finding fault with Platonism, and are discovering that they don't believe in Platonism, and are finding in the essence of Platonism a true world fabricated out of psychological needs. Now, Nietzsche himself sometimes claims that as his actual insight in Beyond Good and Evil, right? He says that he's the guy. Nietzsche is the guy who has discovered that all previous philosophies were only the involuntary confession of the psychological needs of their authors. Right? He doesn't claim that that was something that Hegel figured out before him, or that Schopenhauer figured out, or anything like that. Right? It's his. So this psychological analysis debunking move on the psychologies of previous philosophers as the reason, as what we now think of as the actual understanding of where things like Platonism come from, he doesn't think is, back in Descartes. He thinks it's quite recent. He thinks it's part of the same scientific and philosophical movement of which he is a part. Nietzsche is a part. He's going to relate some of that to greater scientism in the 19th century, also to greater historical understanding, historical sense. That men by the study of history have come to appreciate this about the, if I'm going to put it this way, the motives of previous thinkers, so to speak. In that regard, Hegel has a kind of pivotal point here. Hegel thinks that all these developments are rational, and as soon as he gives his arguments why they're rational, people come along and explode them all, and they say, oh no, that wasn't rational at all. And they give a different version of history, which is a way less rational process, and a much more impassioned process, and a much more biased process, so to speak. And the result is they uncover all these ways in which these lower forces, so to speak, are the actual causes of ideas, right? Or the success of this idea as opposed to that idea. I think it's Acton who says there's no discovery in history so upsetting as that which unclothes the pedigree of ideas, right? That's the 19th century historical sense mining the past. That Nietzsche sees as being behind this loss of faith in the true world doctrines. The true world doctrines are also being dissolved by skepticism in the Socratic sense, not Socratic sense, the Scottish sense, like the David Hume sense, and by the critical movement. And think of Kant and his attacks on previous dogmatic philosophy that could pretend to know the truth about deism or something like that, right? All of those critical, skeptical successes of modern philosophy are so many overthrown previous schemes for true true standards behind the world, right? So they may think that they were only going after the one particular one of them, but the cumulative effect is that all the dogmatisms are collapsing, right? From Nietzsche's point of view, the fundamental point where that goes from being one or two particular things to being a general thing is when the fact that the true worlds were fabricated solely out of psychological needs becomes obvious or becomes generally accepted, which he thinks is happening in his own philosophy. Okay. So I just wanted to get some of that. Go ahead.
I comment on this, nothing, Plato coming up with it and then nobody really examining it until Nietzsche comes along. And I'm kind of surprised that in his precursors of, who are nihilists, he doesn't include Diogenes the Cynic, who immediately attacks Platonism as complete rubbish, and is pretty close to what we might consider a nihilist, in that he walks around naked and sleeps in a barrel and doesn't care for any material goods or values of the sort. So it seems that, right away, Plato has this criticism that's set aside by Christianity and scholasticism, and all the way through to Hegel, who is still, if it's not God, there's the absolute spirit that's behind everything. And then finally Nietzsche comes along and says, God is dead, and so are all value systems. But you actually find this throughout history. It's not the dominant paradigm, but I think people have always pushed back against it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that you get the counterbeat to it often. I don't know that Diogenes thinks of himself as a moralist, and he thinks of himself as having like an incredible superiority over those who are attached to their stupid worldly things and aren't able to live a natural life as he is. So in that sense, he's less of a debunker and more of a projector of his own ideals into the heavens than Nietzsche would want. The people that Nietzsche himself appeals to are Epicurus, the Epicureans throughout history, Democritus, Protagoras, Heraclitus, lots of the medieval Epicureans or early modern Epicureans, people like Montaigne. I mean, he has plenty of people he can point to as the history's cynics, so to speak. And not cynics in the sense of actual Diogenes the Cynic, but in the sense of the scoffers at religion and at notions of objective truth behind the world. Most of them usually in the name of some more natural standard. That
like Hume you mentioned, the skeptics could also be considered.
Right, but the skeptics, if you look at what the skeptics believed in or acted upon in morality, right, you'll find that that although they don't believe in two-world doctrines, they typically have a fairly easygoing notion of what counts as the natural life, the good as pleasure or something, and they do think that they can you can read off from reality the proper way to behave. They just don't think it's the moralizing, societally approved way to behave. They think it's a much more retiring, individual, personal life and natural way to behave, right? That's what you find in the Epicureans, for example, right? They would no truck with religion. But the good is pleasure.
I had
right?
a quick. Sorry, I had a quick. I wanted to make sure that I got clarification from something Pete said at the end of when you said, that Nietzsche gets to his God is dead thing and then the loss of all values. Would you say that the Nietzschean way to phrase that would be the loss of the perception of objective values that have a transcendent nature? Because it was the perception that we had in objective transcendent morality is what we actually were experiencing, not an actual one. So the loss of that perception of an objective transcendent morality is what Nietzsche thought that he was getting rid of, as opposed to just values as, because the way you referred to it is as if they actually exist. But from Nietzsche's perspective, you wouldn't say it that way.
Yeah, so, and I think metaphysically they actually existed. So the scholastics believed that all these things descended from God, and we just had to understand it, that it wasn't just, one person perceives it this way, the other person the other. They thought there was an absolute standard there. And I see Hegel as sort of in the same vein. So he can't get rid of God because he's the professor in Berlin, and it would be, he'd be persecuted by the people who put him there, gave him tenure, or maybe by the religious authorities. Certainly the scholastics would have been persecuted by the church if they presented something else. So I think Nietzsche's the one who finally points out, if not God and no other system, there is no absolute system of values, therefore nihilism.
Okay.
Right. I mean, I think that that's his self-characterization. I think that there are people before him trying to say similar things. You get relativists among the Greeks. You get and yeah, I mean, there's plenty of nuance in the history. You don't have to underwrite all of Nietzsche's simplifications of the history, but in terms of his self-understanding, he does think he does present this as being more or less everyone is following Plato and Aristotle until the modern times, and then the people sniping at Plato and Aristotle in their particular ways are not believing particular aspects of their scheme while retaining their basic scheme, and if they're putting something in the place of the previous transcendent ideals, they're putting in some utilitarian standard ideal instead, or some nature-based standard ideal instead, but they have some cosmic objective argument in support of whatever it is they're claiming, not simply their will or edict, right? And that's what he is saying has collapsed, because nobody believes in any of those things anymore, and everyone sees all of them as only masks of the interests of the legislators, so to speak. And having done so, they don't see any particular reason to obey the edicts of these legislators as opposed to those legislators. Okay, so we got to get to categories now. So you were particularly interested in this, Pete, but the first thing to notice is part of the aside about the original meaning of categories, the typical Heideggerian specialty, but I don't know how much of it actually matters to the objections to the Nietzsche part. But the fundamental thing going on here is that Heidegger is pointing out that Nietzsche is viewing categories like purpose, unity, truth, and being as being values, not as being areas of metaphysical or philosophical understanding where it is a matter of truth, not goodness. And he also specifically notices that in one, like he has one passage where he's talking about it, another passage where he's referring back to it, and the parallelism, being in one place is replaced by truth in the other place, where both mean the true world as the second of the two worlds notion, right? So the being world is the world behind the world that's behind becoming, and truth are used synonymously, and both are treated as values. So what Heidegger is pointing out here is that Nietzsche thinks of those philosophical categories as being values. And this leads to the question, what is a value? What is it? And what does it mean for a value to be grounded? Which he had raised a little bit earlier. Why are values and grounds related to one another? But for just questions, thoughts people had on the categories section. Joe?
Well, I was pleased to read the historical part. Your own explication here a minute ago sort of left me beginning to wonder how much I actually understood about this. So thank you for you're saying my mind.
You're saying the fact that it wasn't obvious to you that he was saying that Nietzsche is doing anything different from what category has always meant.
No, I thought he was trying to say that Nietzsche was doing something different, but I've somehow misplaced in my mind how we ended up there, and you're going to tell me.
Well, maybe. Nietzsche says, without further justification, that the highest values are categories of reason. That characterization is, again, the same as what you could get in Kant or Aristotle.
Right.
Certainly. Right. So he's the being and thinking characterization. Is a question of the highest determinations of being as a whole in the matter that Nietzsche calls cosmological values. Is able to see two categories that Nietzsche, with no further explanation or justifications, call these uppermost values categories and conceives them as categories, shows how decisively he thinks along the path of metaphysics. But why is he calling them values, basically? Right. The point is that would any of these previous people have called those things values? Would Aristotle have called his table of categories a table of values? Would he have said quantity, quality, substance, and accident are values? You would never find that in Aristotle.
No, but I'm beginning to wonder, am I misunderstanding here the distinction that Aristotle might have made between values and these categories? And what Nietzsche is saying.
Aristotle would never have brought up values at all. That's
right.
The fundamental point, right? So, so the thing that Heidegger is pointing out here is how new it is to view these categories of reason as values. And what's going on there is the previous philosophers thought that they were reading off characteristics of the bones of being, so to speak, the nature of the world, right? And that were objectively there outside the mind, discoverable, but not constructible and not made by man. And Nietzsche is seeing all those things, not just better and worses, or I prefer this to that things, but basic, fundamental, categorical bones of reality, the walls of the world concepts, as being values in the sense of legislatively projected acts of human will. Right?
Right. So human volition enters into here. That's what clarifies it for us.
Yes. And the point
Aristotle
is,
didn't have human volition built in.
Well, Aristotle might have had a doctrine of human volition, and he would have talked about human volition in other respects, and he could talk about, when does human volition come into making a house and so forth. He would happily talk about all that all day, right? But he would not think the distinction between being and becoming was a legislative act, right? He would not see the difference between, something being in a unity versus something being a plurality as being a one of the 10 commandments, right? So the change in perspective of seeing these things as values is that Nietzsche is seeing as legislated, created, willfully made for human purposes, artificial constructs and techne, things which previous philosophers would have understood as objective facts about the world, the basic laws of thinking, any of those things, right? So it's the whole understanding of the room in which man lives, so to speak. The room in which man lives for Nietzsche is fundamentally a room full of drive created acts of previous legislation, right? Rather than fundamentally a space not made by man, nature, a prior objective environment that we simply learn about and discover, right? He's seeing invention where previously people saw discovery. He's seeing acts of will where previously people saw only, reflecting facts dispassionately, etc. And that means he's turning reason into a active tool in a way that has, bias and perspective built into it from, the very fundament. So that's the main point that Heidegger is emphasizing here, and that's part.
Go ahead. In your metaphor of the room in which we live, it's almost as if the room in which you live is populated by all kinds of stuff. We look around, we see what we would think are objects, and those are actually sort of there before we walked into that room, when we were thrown in, and we don't realize that not only are they created by man, they were created by men that came before us, and we just bought into them. That might be the difference between authenticity, is that when you realize that you can actually think about them yourself and change them. I don't know.
Partly right. You mentioned that they're objects, and this is part of it because we're headed towards the understanding of the nature of modern subjective philosophy, right? The object is what is constructed by the mind and standing over against the thinking subject, right? Mm-hmm. And Nietzsche is already starting from that point. He's starting from the point that the mental image of the thing and is the thing, so to speak. There's a little bit in Jacobi, if I'm going to go back for just a second. Okay.
If you're putting words in Nietzsche's mouth with this, it sounds like very phenomenological interpretation of categories.
It's possible that Heidegger is putting some words into Nietzsche's mouth on some of this. Nietzsche does not focus on the category aspect of it, but he does focus on the value aspect of it. And I think that to see all previous categorical thinking in value terms, it's fair to see that in Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil in particular, for example. But Heidegger is the one who's contrasting that with previous understanding of conceptual thinking. I think partly this is because of where he's going. He's trying to show the ways in which Nietzsche is an example of modern subjective philosophy. So he's sort of steering us towards Protagoras Descartes a little bit here. But it's also to bring out what is new in Nietzsche, what is unusual in him. This is Jacobi talking to Fichte. The philosophizing of pure understanding must therefore be a chemical process through which everything outside of it is transformed into nothing and leaves only it behind, a spirit so pure that it cannot exist in this purity, but can only generate everything. This again, however, in such purity that it likewise cannot itself exist, but can only be present, contemplated as the productions of spirit. The whole thing, a mere deed equals deed. All human beings, insofar as they strive for knowledge, establish without being aware of it. Pure philosophy is the ultimate goal, because the human being knows only by comprehending, and he comprehends only by transforming a thing into a mere form, the form into a thing, something he can construct. We comprehend a thing only insofar as we can construct it, make it originate, come into existence before us in thought. Insofar as we cannot construct it, we cannot ourselves produce it in thought, and we do not actually comprehend it. So the point is that the completely comprehended thing is the thing that you can spin out in its essence in your imagination, and it's unsurprising that the result is a creature of the imagination. So anyway, that's not from Nietzsche or even from our text, but in the direction I think we're heading. Okay. Pete, I feel like there's things you wanted to ask about categories which we haven't gotten to.
No, I mean, I just enjoyed going over, what did the word mean,
Right.
and why does Nietzsche suddenly start talking about categories instead of values? And you've already addressed a bit of that. So I didn't stumble on this. I just
Yep.
enjoyed reading.
Got it. I mean, so for those who weren't, the thing about category is, the category is the public accusation of what a thing is. That's it's the public charge you bring in court. You categorize the thing as this is a table. I convicted of being a table. But the declared public accusation of what a thing is the original meaning of category.
Right, because you can also see a value as being just a form of measurement. So you could say, oh, the value of something is its color or its price. The value of something is $23, and we have all these things, and we just have to figure out what the value is of each of them, versus something the category is its essence. And like you said, in a court case, this is a table, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Not a property of the table, but what it is itself. So things have essences, and then we can organize them into different categories based on what we care about right now about those objects. And value systems are like that. Different people with different value systems might look at a situation and understand it different because they have different categories or values to assign.
We'll come to the perspective of this, perspectival aspect in a second. But the first thing to understand for Nietzsche is that for Nietzsche, the value of things is not just a matter of if you have a different value system, you'll have a different perspective on it, right? For him, values are a more and less question that has like an actual answer. One or the other actually succeeds the other in the stream of becoming. There's a higher and a lower value. There's a stronger and a weaker in Nietzsche that is part and parcel of valuation. Yes, all those things are perspectival in the sense of for some people, for some purposes, to some ends, but those purposes and ends themselves are also involved in the same value struggle as to which of them is going to succeed the other in the stream of becoming. There's a determinism of outcome in Nietzsche's notion of value thinking that is missing from sort of later easygoing relativist versions of value thinking, so to speak, where all possible values are just different views of things which can happily coexist with one another and don't interfere with each other, and everyone just agrees to disagree about the nature of the importance of this thing. No, not so in Nietzsche. In Nietzsche, they are interests of particular constructs of domination, one of which wins and imposes its understanding of the value of that thing on the succeeding states of the world. So it is always struggle. It is not simply subjective disagreement or opinion. The thing which that does have in common with disagreement is he does view these things as perspectival in the sense there's always some viewpoint or group or person with a set of interests that is viewing the thing that way and seeing that value in it. But if they see that value in it and it isn't there, they're just going to lose one of those struggles, right? From Nietzsche's point of view, there's a survival of the not even the truest, but the effectively truest, or effectively true enough in the nature of value itself. That is kind of the objective adjudicating process in the chaos that's determining which of these things succeeds. It's not just a disinterested set of disembodied opinions passively viewing things, right? They're all for action, and those actions are in competition with one another in one evolving chaos.
I had a quick question, but it's
Go.
towards the end of the chapter.
Go ahead.
And I don't want to, it's towards the end of the chapter, and I get a sense that it's answered a bit in 7, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
Sure.
It's at the end of page 41 and beginning of 42, where he says, the second thing we must point out in our textual analysis of the last sentence in section A is the way in which Nietzsche summarily names the categories by which beings as a whole have been interpreted. Instead of meaning, he says purpose, instead of totality, systemization, unity, etc. But then he ends by saying, he says it's all without offering an explanation. And he gives a little bit of an explanation of why there's not an explanation. But I was wondering, even with what was in 7, I still don't feel like I have a good grasp of why he doesn't offer more explanation. We have to depend on ourselves and Heidegger to sort of interpret. And, I was wondering, A, if you think that's true and accurate, and can we flesh it out even more than what Heidegger's saying? Because I still don't feel like I've really gotten a good explanation about why he was so scant about it, other than the fact that he didn't mean to publish it. And
I think it's partly Heidegger is interested in this precisely because when Nietzsche is being flip or isn't explaining himself thoroughly, is going over something quickly, Heidegger can see the almost unconscious assumptions that Nietzsche is bringing to the topic, right? And the one that caught Heidegger's eye here, like lightning, was that he replaced being with truth, as though they were synonyms. And they're very far from being synonyms in Heidegger's philosophy, right? They're related concepts, but they're fundamentally different concepts of which you have a whole articulation. And for Nietzsche, in the context at least of this role in thinking about nihilism, or thinking about evasion of nihilism, or finding purpose in things, being and truth are substitutable for one another for Nietzsche. And that to Heidegger means that the notion of truth that Nietzsche is using here is one in which true is restricted to the Platonic true world behind becoming, right? It's being used as a term of contrast with becoming, and it means the true world behind becoming, as opposed to the mere appearance world of phenomena of changeable appearances which aren't really real. That sort of Platonic dichotomy is governing that substitution as far as Heidegger is concerned. And partly that's just Nietzsche is, abiding by the Platonism in the views that he is diagnosing, that is, Nietzsche is diagnosing. But it may also be a way in which Nietzsche himself is still thinking in the same metaphysical scheme, which is of interest to Heidegger if true. But I think the reason this caught Heidegger's attention was not that he was expecting a longer explanation, but that in the absence of an explanation, he sees Nietzsche substituting the word being for the word truth, as though they were synonymous in this context. And that to him is, a giant ringing bell, right? Because they're not the same thing at all to Heidegger. Does that help?
I think Heidegger complicates it. I mean, he has his truth of being, and he uses truth in 3 different senses of aletheia. And so in the clearing, that's the truth of being, sometimes spelled with a Y instead of an I. And at the phenomenological level, the being of beings, there's also the truth of constant presence, of what is directly unveiled in front of us. And in a few places, he also uses aletheia as correspondence. So, in his 50 years of writing stuff down, Heidegger's not always consistent in his use of the word truth.
Oh, sure, but none of those 3, right, is remotely like Nietzsche's use of it here, right? Nietzsche is saying things like the fundamental characteristic of the world is not that it's true, but that it is false, right? And then he's also saying that the concern with purposes doesn't work. The concern with systematic understanding or unity doesn't work, and the concern with being doesn't work, or the concern with truth doesn't work. And he'll use the two synonymously, being or truth. And that's because for Nietzsche, being and truth are both being used here as terms for one pole in a Platonic scheme, right? In which the true world and the being world are both contrasted with the apparent world and the becoming world, right? And that dichotomy is, to Nietzsche, still central to the whole nihilism process. The nihilism process is the one where the apparent world is devalued because you put all value in a true world behind the world, and then you lost belief in that, and you're left with a world of becoming and appearance that you don't believe in, find false, and have already emptied of all value, right? And from Nietzsche's point of view, this is a very simple use of a term to adhere to a Platonic metaphysical usage, and it doesn't have the kind of freight that Heidegger sees in it. Truth is kind of a freighted term for Nietzsche, being much less so. But from Heidegger's point of view, that means that Nietzsche is missing fundamental problematics about metaphysics, right? Okay, so that's just on this same topic of noticing the place where Heidegger's language ends and Nietzsche's language begins, so we can keep track of the differences between them. I want to move on to 7 to 9, right? The sections on nihilism, the man of history, the new valuation, and nihilism as history. The fundamental thing going on here is that there's two notions of history running around, right? And maybe two different sets of actors in it. But there is a notion of history, which is Nietzsche's notion of history here, and there's a different notion of history of Heidegger's. And Heidegger is effectively inviting us to participate in the drama of European history by understanding Nietzsche and thinking Nietzsche's thoughts in order to reach the forefront at which the future history of the West is being decided, so to speak. And that is different from what Nietzsche is presenting as what history is. So Nietzsche is presenting this process of nihilism results in not only a particular process of this devaluation, but lots of different reactions to it. There's a whole spectrum of reactions to it. You get 6 different kinds of nihilism and different kinds of reactions to nihilism and attempts to evade nihilism without revaluing values and so on, right? And from Nietzsche's point of view, what is inevitable and necessary and going to happen in that process, and what are its stages along the way, where it has to come out, what the only way out of the maze is, so to speak, that is all what matters to Nietzsche for the future history, if I can put it that way. The past history is only necessary to know how we got here, and Nietzsche thinks he is knows the way forward, so to speak. And the way forward is this beginning to do consciously what previously man did unconsciously, right? But all of that is presented as what the man of European history, Heidegger calls him, what the higher men, as Nietzsche would call him, will in the future do, right? I don't even want to call that a notion of human action in Nietzsche, because I don't think it actually is. It's more of a set of judgments and diagnoses of different folks depending upon where they come out in all of that, right? The process almost doesn't care what you do about it. The process is going to go where it's going to go, right? but it is something which Nietzsche himself sees as, you know, the history of the next 2 centuries. He says that the fundamental thing going on is the hyperbolic naivete of man. What is the hyperbolic naivete of man? The hyperbolic naivete of man is to believe that he's only obeying an objective standard when he's actually obeying his either his own or somebody else's legislated unconscious interests and needs, right? That's the naive man, the good man, he calls him at another point. The man of morality is the person who is predisposed to obey a standard he regards as objective outside of man. And that's the person who is being overtaken by the new revaluation, right? The notion of sorry, he gives all the incomplete forms of nihilism and says that we live right in the midst of it. All attempts to circumvent nihilism without revaluating prior values produce the opposite and make the problem more acute. He gives all kinds of examples of the typical 19th century ideological positions and dodges of, you know, what people are substituting for their previous ideals, when many of them are political slogan-like ideals, ideals of progress, ideals of political theory, whatever. And when he says that they make the problem worse, the point that he's making there, it's a little bit terse, but is that they're even faker than the originals, right? They like wear on their sleeves the fact that they are, you know, transparently fake standards. You can now like read right off of them that they are ideologically in the purpose, you know, for the purpose of the interests of this or that party, but they're still pretending to be some objective impersonal thing, right? And nobody believes it. Is the fundamental claim. Was that part clear in 9 or not? This is the different kinds of nihilism when he talks about incomplete nihilism. So Nietzsche's claim is that nihilism determines the historicity of this history. Nihilism is history. It's his substitute for the Hegelian logic of history. It's the workings of providence. It's the nature of progress. It's, you know, the history of the next 2 centuries. It's all of these things which are kind of required working out of the logic of the process, right? And in that required working out of the logic of the process, the endpoint that Nietzsche himself has laid out as the self-conscious propagation of new values that will completely revalue the previous ones is presented as the classical nihilist bright path forward, so to speak. But all the others around are, you know, the various forms of cul-de-sac that are involved in incomplete passages through nihilism, attempts to deny it, attempts to evade it, etc. So he says, Nietzsche's exposition, which began as an enumeration of the conditions for the emergence of nihilism as a mere description of its course, now suddenly sounds like a declaration of what we are acting out, indeed must act out. It is not a question here of historically recognition of past events and their effects on the present. Something imminent is at stake, something barely underway, involving decisions and tasks whose transitional character is interpreted as investing values in and withdrawing values from the world, right? So the point here is that Nietzsche is not trying to describe a process in which none of you were involved, right? On the contrary. And Heidegger is partly agreeing with that, partly. But in Nietzsche's view, the fundamental human action involved is the process of investing and withdrawing values from the world. And the fundamental question is how consistently that is done, how consistently is Platonism or the doctrine of true worlds overthrown, and how consciously does something new replace it? End of 9, he's saying, all these values are psychological act and results of particular perspective utility for the preservation and enhancement of human construct of domination. They have only been falsely projected into the essence of things. It is always and everywhere the hyperbolic naivete of man, putting himself as the meaning of standard of value for things. So, and the point of that is not that man should not consider himself the standard of values of things, but that he has done so with naivete. He has not recognized that is what he was doing as he was doing it. So first on that first level is the level of historical action that Nietzsche himself is describing in these 3 chapters clear to people or not? People don't know.
Okay. Makes sense.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what Heidegger is saying Nietzsche said. I haven't read, Will to Power and so forth close enough to have a strong opinion.
Right.
Well, I have to say, if you want feedback, I thought that the contrast that popped into my mind was with Hegel and the reason winning out in history. And this is nihilism as an inevitable mechanism for history. And that it's, I saw nihilism as
Yes.
just a mechanism.
In one stage of it, though, but yes. From Nietzsche's point of view, it is a single transitional stage when we leave behind the leading apron springs of nature, and where we thought that we were obeying only natural or godly laws, and replace it with one where we know that we're obeying human laws, right? So in a way, this is it's his version of the transition to the realm of freedom in a Hegelian sense, right? There's going to be a future of mankind in which mankind is its own legislator, but that begins now, when man is fully conscious of the fact that he is his only legislator.
Well, there are always men who knew they were their own legislators. The priests and the people who built the statues and all this.
Well, think about priests for a second, though. I mean, most priests, as such, think that they're obeying some higher duty or calling, right? There may be some cynical few among them who don't, but they're rarities, and it's not usually considered a useful way of climbing higher in that hierarchy. The difference is these are to be legislators for whom the conscious goal of their legislation is dominance and nothing else. Anyways, that this sort of human type should be cultivated and should exist is the content of the legislation that he's talking about. And he says, this is Nietzsche, with every growth of man in greatness and height, there is also a growth in depth and terribleness. One should not will the one without the other, or rather, the more radically we will the one, the more radically we achieve precisely the other. Doesn't sound terribly reassuring, right? Not to put too fine a point upon it. I want to contrast all that notion of historical action, though, with Heidegger's own notion of historical action in this section. Because it's there, it's quiet, but it's there. Anyone else notice this? There's a places where he starts calling this our history, and what he means by that, this is again referring back to the kind of anthropology of being in time. What makes something part of our history in the sense of my history, in the sense of the first person possessive pronoun, plural or singular, is that it matters for my future decisions. right? The historicity of Dasein in being in time has to do with the real possibilities of that individual Dasein's life, right? If it's not going to change what your own future decisions, it's not historical. The invitation is to from Heidegger is to understand what Nietzsche is doing here and to think what he is doing here in order to be at the same level of the history that he describes as happening. But Heidegger is inviting us to participate in that as something which matters to us without agreeing with pretty much any of the rest of Nietzsche's diagnosis of this. We need to understand that this is what the philosopher Nietzsche at the end of metaphysics, that is ending metaphysics, says is happening at the end of metaphysics. But if we are to understand that, it's to participate in the future philosophical decisions that will determine what happens next. It's not to participate in this Nietzschean project in one or another capacity, nor is it simply to observe this from the outside as something which is happening on Mars or doesn't matter for us. The claim is that something is at stake in the future of European history, and we're only going to be awake and aware of it if we have previously thought Nietzsche's philosophy through to the end. And that is a different notion of of historical action than the one you're finding from Nietzsche himself. It's something like an ethic of thoughtfulness to understand where you are, or something like that. And it's not about overcoming nihilism, and it's not about legislating for future mankind. None of those are things that Heidegger is urging you to do. He's pointing out to you that Nietzsche is urging people to do that, but Heidegger isn't urging you to do that. He's urging you to pay attention and think through what Nietzsche is saying and what it means about the history of metaphysics. I don't know if this is something which only I pick up on, but I notice when he talks about, you know, our history, and here we move into a realm of things which are a matter of decision and so forth. All of those things are ways of characterizing it in terms of his own understanding of historical action. Heidegger has this weird, unusual understanding of something like the moral or responsible nature of thinking itself in history that is coming up here.
Is that
Yeah,
starting about age
I didn't.
55?
Oh,
Page 55?
sorry. Go ahead.
It's around pages 53 to 55, yes.
Okay.
Sorry,
I
James?
think I didn't come to as clear of a conclusion as you and as precise, but like I said in the beginning, I got the sense he was saying we're leaving behind the Nietzsche's metaphysical view of nihilism, and we're coming into a new era in history where we're going to be the ones tasked with leaving all of that behind in a way of nothingness, where we're tasked with having to be creating the new history that is to come forward. So to me, it was more like, you know, we're in this, whenever I see history with Heidegger now, him using the term history a lot, I start to, my antenna goes up, okay, he's trying to talk about what we're going to have to do. And, you know, he's getting into his ideas of where philosophy goes here, where human beings thought goes. So I kind of got a sense of it, but I didn't precisely say, oh, he's saying our and things like that. So I think I was in the forest, maybe near the tree where the bullseye was.
It's easy to miss it because so much of what he's doing is just explicating Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche's understanding of this history can just be so much at the front of it that you can't see that there are even two notions going on. And you know, Nietzsche's understanding of what that history is okay.
So where does he actually say our history?
Yeah, let me find it. Okay, so some of it is at the very end of 57, but there's another place where you talk about it. Give me a second. Right, that's earlier.
Because I would say that the place where, in this passage, where he's talking about what Heidegger wants to talk about would be in 55, the paragraph after the first quotation. In the middle, he says, the condition of uncertainty in which prior values are deposed and new values not yet posited consists in the fact there is no truth in itself, although there is still truth. And there, that's Heidegger's talking about what he means by truth. But truth has yet to be newly defined. And, that's Heidegger's task.
I think that's partly Heidegger's cast. Some of that is also Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche is not going to disagree with much of that. Okay, just a second. Let me look for where I was.
See, Nietzsche doesn't provide us with a new definition of truth or being. That's something he's just using the words like previous philosophers.
I mean, he did give us a different notion of truth as truth as a form of error without which a certain kind of being cannot live, that we talked about back in chapter 3. So
he uses it in chapter 11, that exact phrase, but he's not. I think it's
maybe
something different. 73.
Yes.
How go we can step out of our history and times and from an absolute standpoint without any definite and therefore necessarily one-sided point of view observe what has been in itself. The same limitation holds for us as it did for Nietzsche.
Some of that stuff in 73, I may be thinking that farther ahead. You're right, because I read ahead. It happens. I think that it starts on the end of 57, probably, and I do think that some of the stuff as late as 73 may involve it. Give me a second. I'm going to look ahead and see if I'm telling you things that are coming. That's not it.
Well, he says behind us, reaches forward far beyond us. So he's already got us. That's when I read that, I was thinking, oh, here we go. We're getting ready to go on the journey with Heidegger. He's going to tell,
Just give me a second.
Yeah. But by the way, I'm going to have to go soon. So if we talk about what we're going to do.
Yes, we can definitely talk about what we're going to do next. We're going to, next time we're going to read sections 10 through 14. And I was thinking because it's relatively short, we could do that in 2 weeks. That's 10 to 14 inclusive. So that's roughly 40 pages.
Right.
So, and the subject matter of this takes us to Protagoras. This is the moral interpretation of metaphysics and anthropomorphism, subjectivity. So all of those things brought together, and it's taking us to the, is Nietzsche just the same thing as man is the measure of all things, of things that are that they are, and that they are not, things that are not that they are not, as in Protagoras. And he's going to claim no, right? That Protagoras means something different by it. But all of that is going to set up the next section, which is going to be all about Nietzsche-Descartes contrast, as the contrast between Nietzsche and earlier modern philosophy. But before then, we have subjectivity, morality, and men and anthropomorphism in Nietzsche's view, right? That's 10 through 14. So the idea is to cover that in one relatively short session, and then Descartes another relatively short session, and then we'll do one larger thing for the whole rest of one, unless you guys tell me you want to break it up. There's a lot of material in sections 21 through 29, but it also forms kind of a unit. And that's only about 60 pages. So the idea was going to be that we're going to do 3 more sessions in part 1, and then all of part 2 will be just 1 session. So at that point, we're at 4 more sessions and we're done with the book. Is that what you needed, Pete? Oh, do you need the time too? I'm thinking in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I got what I needed.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll put something on for like the 30th. Thank you.
Good.
I got to go too. Thanks very much, Jason.
All right.
and
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you, Steve. All right. Do we, should we end recording?
So we got all the way to 10.
We did.